In March 2023, a graduate student in geospatial analysis at the University of Buenos Aires noticed something unusual while processing satellite imagery for her thesis on deforestation patterns in the Gran Chaco region. 47 kilometers northwest of Philadelphia, Paraguay, hidden beneath triple canopy jungle that registers temperatures 15 degrees cooler than surrounding terrain, geometric patterns appeared in the synthetic aperture radar data, straight lines and right angles that shouldn't exist in primary rainforest. When the coordinates were cross-referenced with declassified CIA files from 1998, a single name appeared in the margin notes of a 1952 intelligence assessment. Hartmann. Possible, unconfirmed. SS Oberführer Klaus Hartmann was declared dead in Berlin on April 29, 1945. His death was confirmed by Wehrmacht chaplain Ernst Müller in a typed statement filed with the provisional government. His body was reportedly buried in a mass grave near the Führer bunker complex alongside hundreds of other casualties from the final defense of the Reich Chancellery. For 78 years, that's where the story ended, until a student analyzing tree density in Paraguay found a compound that had been hidden since the Eisenhower administration. That compound led investigators to a cache of documents that had been sealed in waterproof containers for decades: a passport, financial records, photographs showing a man who was supposed to be dead standing in front of a sawmill on land he owned under a different name. If you want to see what satellite technology and archival detectives discovered in that jungle clearing, hit the like button. What they found inside will challenge everything we thought we knew about how thoroughly Nazi war criminals were pursued after 1945. The death certificate exists, filed in the Provisional Berlin Administrative Records on May 2, 1945, signed by a chaplain who listed his military identification number, processed by a clerk whose handwriting matches other authenticated documents from the same period. Klaus Hartmann, age 38, cause of death listed as artillery shrapnel wound to the thorax, time of death approximately 1600 hours on April 29th, standard procedure. What the death certificate doesn't mention is that Wehrmacht chaplain Ernst Müller was stationed 43 kilometers from the Reich Chancellery on April 29th, according to his unit's movement logs, which were captured intact by Soviet forces and declassified in 1991. He couldn't have confirmed Hartmann's death because he wasn't there to witness it. Nobody noticed that contradiction for 47 years. Klaus Hartmann joined the SS in 1936, assigned to the administrative branch, not the combat divisions that would later become synonymous with war crimes, but the logistics apparatus that made those crimes possible. By 1942, he held the rank of Oberführer, equivalent to a senior colonel, overseeing supply chain operations for SS economic enterprises in occupied Poland. His responsibilities included railway scheduling, warehouse inventory management, and the procurement of industrial equipment for factories that operated using concentration camp labor. He wasn't a household name. He didn't give speeches or appear in propaganda films. He was an accountant with a military rank, processing requisition forms and shipping manifests, while millions of people died in the system those manifests supported. The historical record places Hartmann in Berlin during the final month of the war. According to his personnel file, captured by American forces in 1945 and archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, he was recalled from his posting in Krakow in March 1945 as Soviet forces advanced. Orders directed him to report to SS headquarters in Berlin for final defense coordination duties, a bureaucratic phrase that typically meant burning documents and preparing for either death or capture. His name appears on a roster dated April 15, 1945, listing SS personnel assigned to defensive positions in the government district. His signature, verified by handwriting analysis conducted in 1947 during the initial wave of denazification proceedings, appears on a requisition form dated April 23, requesting ammunition and medical supplies. Then the death certificate, filed 8 days after his last documented signature. The file was closed. The U.S. Army's Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects included his name with the notation, "Deceased Berlin, April 1945. The documentation seemed complete. a mid-ranking logistics officer who died in the war's final hours alongside thousands of others buried in the chaos of a collapsing regime. For investigators in 1945 and 1946, working through tens of thousands of cases with limited resources and competing priorities, the death certificate was sufficient. It came from a Wehrmacht chaplain, a religious figure, presumably credible. It matched the pattern of countless other deaths during Berlin's fall. There was no body, but that wasn't unusual given the mass graves and Soviet cleanup operations that removed thousands of corpses in the immediate aftermath. The case stayed closed until a graduate student studying rainforest canopy detected geometric shapes that were too precise to be natural. Now back to March 2023, where Maria Delgado was running synthetic aperture radar analysis on a 70-square-kilometer section of the Paraguayan Chaco for her thesis on land use change. The technology penetrates vegetation using microwave frequencies, revealing ground features invisible to standard optical satellites, perfect for tracking illegal logging operations beneath jungle cover. She wasn't looking for Nazi fugitives. She was counting trees. The anomaly appeared in grid reference 22 degrees, 54 minutes, 17 seconds south, 60 degrees, 17 minutes, 43 seconds west. The radar signature showed a clearing approximately 120 meters long and 80 meters wide, with linear features indicating human construction. What made it unusual wasn't the clearing itself. The Chaco has scattered settlements and farming operations, but its location. 47 kilometers from the nearest paved road, accessible only by unmarked dirt tracks that didn't appear in any official land registry. The property itself didn't exist in modern records. No ownership documents filed with the Paraguayan government, no tax assessments, no utility connections, though power lines ran within 18 kilometers of the site. Delgado noted the coordinates in her thesis work but didn't investigate further until she mentioned the finding to her thesis advisor, Dr. Roberto Quintana, who had worked with historical preservation groups documenting German immigrant settlements in Paraguay. Dr. Quintana recognized the geographic region. The Chaco had served as a destination for German-speaking Mennonite communities in the 1920s and 1930s, but it had also attracted other German immigrants in the late 1940s and early 1950s, immigrants whose origins and motives were less clearly documented. Dr. Quintana forwarded the coordinates to Heinrich Weber, a retired German prosecutor who had spent 32 years investigating Nazi war crimes and tracking fugitives who fled to South America. Weber had compiled a database cross-referencing CIA reports, Red Cross travel documents, and ship manifests from the immediate post-war period, the infrastructure of escape that allowed wanted men to vanish into new identities in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay. Weber ran the coordinates against his database and found a reference in a 1952 CIA intelligence assessment, a memo produced by an agency field officer in Buenos Aires who reported on possible locations of former German nationals of interest in Paraguay. The memo, declassified in 1998 as part of a broader release of documents related to Operation Paperclip and post-war intelligence failures, contained 17 locations described in vague terms: German timber operation northwest of Philadelphia, agricultural settlement near Mariscal Estigarribia, small manufacturing concern in the Chaco interior. The memo included handwritten margin notes. Most were initials or brief comments. Investigated, negative. Mennonite community, cleared. No confirmation possible. Next to the entry for the timber operation northwest of Philadelphia, a single word in pencil: Hartman. The question mark mattered. It indicated uncertainty, a lead that hadn't been pursued to conclusion. The memo contained no follow-up, no indication that anyone had traveled to the location or verified the information. The trail appeared to have gone cold in 1952, buried in the vast accumulation of fragmentary intelligence reports that filled filing cabinets and then archived boxes as priorities shifted toward the Cold War. Weber contacted the Paraguayan Interior Ministry's Historical Crimes Unit in April 2023. They assigned 2 investigators to accompany him to the coordinates. The journey from Asunción took 11 hours, paved highway to Philadelphia, then unmarked dirt roads that required GPS navigation and a four-wheel drive vehicle capable of handling terrain that turned to impassable mud during the rainy season. They reached the approximate coordinates on April 18, 2023. What they found had been abandoned for decades, but was unmistakably the product of careful planning and substantial investment. The main structure measured 18 meters long by 12 meters wide, concrete foundation with timber frame construction that had resisted the jungle's attempts at reclamation better than might be expected after 60 years of neglect. The roof had partially collapsed, but walls remained intact. Windows had been glass, the frames still held fragments, unusual for jungle construction in that era, which typically relied on wooden shutters. 3 outbuildings stood in a precise geometric arrangement: a generator shed, a storage building with reinforced doors, the metal still bearing flakes of industrial paint, a structure that appeared to be a workshop with rusted equipment inside that investigators would later identify as sawmill machinery, blade housings, conveyor mechanisms, hydraulic components. The clearing itself showed evidence of cultivation. Fruit trees, mango, papaya, citrus varieties, arranged in rows that had long since grown wild but retained their original spacing. A well, hand-dug, lined with concrete rings that bore manufacturer marks from a Brazilian company that operated in the 1950s and 1960s. Most significantly, a cleared area approximately 30 meters from the main building where concrete pylons indicated the foundation of a structure that had been deliberately dismantled. The pylons were spaced in a pattern consistent with a radio antenna array, a communication system capable of reaching beyond the immediate jungle isolation. The investigators photographed everything, collected GPS coordinates, and began a systematic search of the main building's interior. What they found inside would prove Klaus Hartmann had lived there under a false identity for at least 15 years after the Third Reich collapsed. The documents were stored in a metal footlocker inside what had been a bedroom closet. The footlocker had been sealed with industrial waterproofing, thick rubber gaskets that had prevented moisture infiltration despite the Chaco's humid climate. When Weber opened it on April 19, 2023, the papers inside were intact, readable, preserved as though they'd been filed away months rather than decades earlier. The most significant items: a Paraguayan identity card issued in 1948 to Carl Stein, age 41, occupation listed as comerciante, merchant. The photograph showed a man with thinning hair, prominent eyebrows, a narrow face, no obvious identifying marks. A Paraguayan passport issued to Carl Stein in 1949. 11 entry and exit stamps showing travel to Argentina and Brazil between 1949 and 1963. The photograph matched the identity card. A property deed dated 1950, registered in the municipality of Mariscal Estigarribia, transferring ownership of approximately 480 hectares in the Chaco region to Carl Stein for a purchase price of 45,000 Paraguayan guaraníes, equivalent to approximately $4,200 dollars at the 1950 exchange rate, or roughly $54,000 in 2024 dollars. Business correspondence on letterhead reading Stein Timber Export Limited. Invoices for lumber shipments to buyers in Argentina, contracts for logging equipment purchased from suppliers in Brazil and Argentina between 1951 and 1961. Personal correspondence, 7 letters written in German, addressed to Carl from someone who signed as E.M. The letters contained no surnames, no addresses, only postmarks from various West German cities between 1953 and 1958. The content was mundane: updates on family matters, comments on weather and health, brief mentions of the business prospering. What made them significant was the handwriting. Weber photographed the letters and sent digital copies to the German Federal Archives, requesting comparison with known samples. The Federal Archives reported back within 6 weeks. The handwriting matched documents signed by Ernst Müller, the Wehrmacht chaplain who had certified Klaus Hartmann's death in 1945. The most damning evidence came from a photograph album stored at the bottom of the footlocker. 47 photographs, black and white, taken between approximately 1950 and 1965, based on clothing styles, vehicle models visible in some images, and the aging progression of the subject. The photographs showed a man, the same man from the identity card and passport, in various settings. Standing beside logging equipment, posed in front of the main compound building when it was newly constructed, sitting at a desk with papers spread before him, drinking coffee on a covered porch, hosting what appeared to be a social gathering, other men in casual clothing holding bottles of beer. In 3 photographs, the man's right hand was visible, palm upward. On the inside of his forearm, approximately 8 centimeters below the elbow joint, a small dark mark appeared, possibly a tattoo, though resolution wasn't sufficient to determine the exact design. Weber sent the photographs to Dr. Andreas Keller, a forensic anthropologist at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, who specialized in facial comparison analysis. Dr. Keller's analysis compared the photograph of Karl Stein with the official SS personnel photograph of Klaus Hartmann from his 1936 recruitment file. The report, completed in July 2023, concluded, facial structure analysis shows strong correspondence in 11 key measurement points, including intercanthal distance, nasal bridge angle, ear positioning, and mandibular width. Allowing for age progression, weight loss, and photographic quality differences, the probability that these images depict the same individual exceeds 94%. The evidence established that Klaus Hartmann had assumed the identity of Karl Stein, obtained legal documents under that false name, purchased property in Paraguay, and operated a business there for at least 15 years after his supposed death in Berlin. What the evidence couldn't immediately establish was how he had escaped Berlin, who helped him, and when the deception began. Now, back to April 1945, where the official story begins to fracture under documentary scrutiny. The death certificate says Hartmann died on April 29th at 1600 hours, but Chaplain Muller, the man who supposedly confirmed the death, was stationed with the 12th Army's rear elements at Belitz, 43 kilometers southwest of Berlin, according to unit movement logs. The 12th Army was attempting to break through Soviet encirclement to link with American forces. Muller's duties placed him with wounded being evacuated from the front, not in Berlin's government district where Hartmann supposedly died. The Wehrmacht's own records show Muller didn't return to Berlin after April 20th. He was captured by Soviet forces on May 2nd at a field hospital near Treuenbrietzen, 37 kilometers from the Reich Chancellery. The death certificate is a forgery, not a sophisticated one. Forgers didn't need sophistication in April 1945 when record-keeping had collapsed and verification was impossible. They just needed a plausible signature and a bureaucratic form that could be filed in the chaos. What investigators believe happened requires reconstructing Hartmann's movements from fragmentary evidence. The last confirmed sighting of Klaus Hartmann in Berlin comes from a document that wasn't initially recognized as significant, a supply requisition dated April 23, 1945. The form requests ammunition, medical supplies, and rations, standard items for defensive positions, but the delivery location is listed as Tempelhof Storage Facility 7K, a warehouse complex 3 kilometers from SS headquarters. Tempelhof was the location of Berlin's airport. By April 23rd, most of Tempelhof was under artillery fire, unusable for conventional flight operations. But small aircraft, reconnaissance planes, courier flights were still attempting landings and takeoffs using damaged runways and taxiways. A separate document, declassified in 2015 from Soviet military intelligence archives, reports the capture of a Luftwaffe ground crew member who testified about irregular flights from Tempelhof between April 20th and April 26th. The testimony, given during interrogation on May 8, 1945, describes pilots flying Fieseler Storch reconnaissance aircraft, small single-engine planes capable of short takeoffs and landings to evacuate priority personnel to airfields outside the Soviet encirclement. The interrogation report lists no names. It describes approximately 15 to 20 flights, destinations including airfields at Rechlin, Lübeck, and Travemünde, areas still under German control in late April 1945. Hartman's personnel file contains a detail that didn't seem relevant until investigators began reconstructing possible escape routes. He held a civilian pilot's license issued in 1938. He had logged approximately 200 hours of flight time before the war, flying sport aircraft as a hobby. The theory investigators developed: Hartman used his logistics expertise and his access to resources in the chaos of Berlin's collapse to arrange his own evacuation. He requisitioned supplies that positioned him near Tempelhof. He obtained a flight out during the window when small aircraft could still operate. He reached territory that American or British forces would soon occupy, where a German officer could surrender under relatively orderly conditions rather than face Soviet capture. Then, the forgery. The death certificate with Müller's signature, either fabricated by Hartman himself using knowledge of bureaucratic procedures, or created by Müller at Hartman's request in exchange for payment or favors. The document was filed in the provisional records that Allied administrators were attempting to reconstruct from fragments and testimonies. Nobody was checking Wehrmacht chaplain deployment logs against death certificates. Nobody had time. The forgery gave Hartman legal death. Once deceased, according to official records, he could disappear into the displaced persons camps, the refugee flows, the administrative chaos that would persist for years. What happened next would remain a mystery for 78 years, until investigators cross-referenced Red Cross travel documents with ship manifests and Paraguayan immigration records. The Red Cross International Committee, operating under a humanitarian mandate to reunite families and assist refugees, issued travel documents to displaced persons in post-war Europe. The process was supposed to include verification of identity, but in practice, overwhelmed officials relied heavily on testimonies from witnesses who claimed to know the applicant. The system was vulnerable to abuse. In the ICRC archives in Geneva, digitized and made searchable in 2018, researchers found a travel document issued on November 14, 1947, to Karl Stein, born in 1907 in Leipzig, Germany. The application was supported by a witness statement from a man who identified himself as a former neighbor, confirming Stein's identity and his status as a refugee from Soviet occupation. The witness statement was typed. The signature was illegible. The ICRC clerk who processed the application noted no concerns. Karl Stein's travel document authorized passage to South America. Ship manifests from the port of Genoa show a Karl Stein departing on the steamship S. Giovanna C. on January 22, 1948, destination Buenos Aires. The passenger list included 847 names: displaced persons, emigrants, refugees seeking new lives in Argentina under immigration programs that welcomed European settlers. Paraguayan immigration records show Karl Stein entering Paraguay from Argentina on March 8, 1948. The entry was logged at the border crossing at Pilcomayo, south of Asunción. Occupation listed as comerciante. No unusual notations. The trail goes cold for 2 years. The next document is the property deed from 1950. Karl Stein purchasing land in the Chaco, beginning the timber operation that would provide both income and isolation. The financial records found in the footlocker provide insight into how the operation functioned. Ledgers handwritten in German show the timber business generating steady revenue between 1951 and 1963. Export sales totaling approximately $180,000 over 12 years, equivalent to $1.8 million in 2024 dollars. Not a fortune, but comfortable income that allowed Hartman to maintain the compound, purchase equipment, and travel periodically to Argentina. The ledgers also show payments to individuals identified only by initials. FG received regular payments labeled transport services. RM received payments for legal consultation. AS received a one-time payment in 1952 labeled documentation assistance. Investigators believe these payments represent the support network that enabled Hartman's continued freedom. Lawyers who processed business documents, officials who overlooked registration irregularities, associates who transported lumber to buyers without asking questions about the seller's background. The letters from Ernst Müller reveal another dimension of that network. Mueller, the chaplain who had signed the false death certificate, maintained contact with Hartman for at least 5 years after the war. The letters contained coded language, references to our mutual friend and the arrangement we discussed, suggesting ongoing coordination. Mueller's post-war life is documented. He returned to civilian ministry, serving as a pastor in Heidelberg from 1948 until his death in 1971. He was never investigated for war crimes. He never faced questions about the death certificate he signed for a man who wasn't dead. He lived quietly, respected in his community, while the man he helped escape ran a timber business in Paraguay. The final piece came from an unexpected source, a deathbed confession in 2019. Friedrich Kemper, age 96, a German immigrant to Paraguay who had operated a trucking business in the Chaco region during the 1950s and 1960s, told his grandson about transporting lumber for Herr Stein from the remote compound to shipping points in Philadelphia. Kemper described Stein as secretive and particular about who visited the property. Kemper claimed that in 1964, Stein had asked him to help dismantle and remove radio equipment from the compound. They had loaded the equipment onto trucks and transported it to Brazil, where Stein sold it to a mining company. Kemper said Stein told him he was closing the business and returning to Europe, though Kemper never confirmed whether Stein actually left Paraguay. The grandson, intrigued by the story, contacted historical researchers in 2020. His testimony led investigators to search for any records of Carl Stein after 1964. They found nothing. No death certificate in Paraguay, no property sales, no border crossing records, no passport renewals. Carl Stein simply disappeared from official records after 1963, the last date stamped in the passport found at the compound. Weber and his team analyzed all available evidence and developed the most probable timeline. Klaus Hartmann escaped Berlin between April 23 and April 26, 1945, likely via small aircraft evacuation to an airfield outside Soviet control. He surrendered to or evaded Allied forces during the final days of the war, blending into refugee populations. He obtained false identity documents, possibly with Chaplain Mueller's assistance, identifying himself as Carl Stein, a refugee with no criminal background. He secured Red Cross travel papers in 1947 using witness testimony that was never verified. He traveled to Argentina in January 1948 and crossed into Paraguay in March 1948. He purchased land in the Chaco in 1950 using funds whose origin remains unclear, possibly savings from his SS position, possibly payment for assets he sold after the war, possibly assistance from other fugitives or sympathizers who financed escape networks. He operated a legitimate timber business for approximately 13 years, generating income while maintaining isolation in one of South America's most remote regions. He traveled occasionally to Argentina and Brazil, always using his Carl Stein identity, never attracting official attention. Sometime around 1963 or 1964, he either died at the compound or decided to relocate, dismantling the radio equipment and abandoning the property. If he relocated, he did so without leaving any documentary trail in Paraguay, Argentina, or Brazil. If he died at the compound, his body was never found. The investigators conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property in August 2023, searching for any indication of burial. They found no evidence of human remains. The most likely scenario, in Weber's assessment, Hartmann left Paraguay in the mid-1960s, possibly returning to Europe under yet another false identity. By 1964, the intensive hunt for Nazi fugitives had diminished. West Germany's statute of limitations on murder would expire in 1965 unless specific cases remained actively prosecuted. A man with resources, caution, and experience evading detection could have returned to Germany and lived out his life in anonymity. What the evidence conclusively proves is this: Klaus Hartmann did not die in Berlin in 1945. He escaped, assumed a false identity, obtained legal documents under that identity through vulnerable systems, and lived freely in Paraguay for at least 15 years. He operated a business, he owned property. He maintained contact with at least one person from his past, the chaplain who had facilitated his official death. He was never captured, never prosecuted, never forced to account for his role in the SS economic apparatus that exploited concentration camp labor and facilitated genocide. The evidence cannot prove he was pursued. The declassified CIA memo from 1952 shows intelligence officials had fragmentary information about Hartman possibly being in Paraguay, but the question mark in the margin notes indicates they never confirmed it. No follow-up investigation occurred. The lead went cold. Whether that represents resource limitations, shifting priorities, bureaucratic failure, or deliberate indifference is impossible to determine from available documents. What's certain is that a wanted war criminal lived openly under a thin false identity for more than a decade, while international courts were prosecuting major Nazi figures, and while governments claimed to be systematically pursuing fugitives. The historical pattern is clear from other documented cases. Adolf Eichmann escaped to Argentina in 1950 and lived there until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. 10 years as a free man despite being one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals. Josef Mengele lived in South America from 1949 until his death in 1979, never captured despite manhunts and intelligence operations. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, lived openly in Bolivia from 1951 to 1983 under the name Klaus Altmann, working with Bolivian security forces and even visiting Europe multiple times before his eventual arrest. These were high-profile cases, men whose crimes were known, whose names appeared on wanted lists, whose photographs circulated among law enforcement agencies. Yet they evaded capture for decades. Klaus Hartmann was not a high-profile case. He was a mid-ranking logistics officer whose name appeared in captured files, but who hadn't committed personally infamous atrocities that would make his pursuit a priority. The bureaucratic apparatus he administered was guilty of profound crimes, but proving individual culpability for a supply chain officer would require extensive investigation that might not result in prosecution. In the calculus of post-war justice, limited resources, Cold War priorities, thousands of potential cases, men like Hartmann simply weren't pursued aggressively. The death certificate closed the file. Nobody verified it because nobody had reason to doubt it. By the time the CIA received fragmentary intelligence in 1952, Hartmann had been dead for 7 years. The intelligence was filed, noted with a question mark, and forgotten. The compound stands today, slowly being reclaimed by jungle. The Paraguayan government has designated it as a protected historical site, not because of Hartmann specifically, but as part of a broader effort to preserve locations connected to the post-war period when Paraguay became a haven for fugitives from Europe. Researchers from the University of Asunción conduct periodic surveys, documenting the deterioration and maintaining the archive of materials found in the footlocker. The photographs, documents, and physical evidence are stored in climate-controlled facilities in Asunción and Berlin. DNA samples collected from the compound, hair recovered from a hairbrush, biological material from a razor, remain in evidence storage, though there are no known living relatives of Klaus Hartmann to provide comparison samples for definitive identification. The trail ends in the mid-1960s. What happened to Klaus Hartmann after he abandoned or left the compound cannot be determined from available evidence. He may have died anonymously in South America. He may have returned to Europe and lived under another identity. He may have moved to yet another country. The Red Cross archives, ship manifests, and immigration records have been searched for any Carl Stein traveling from South America to Europe between 1963 and 1970. Multiple Carl Steins appear. The name was common enough that disambiguation is impossible without photographs or additional identifying information. Weber, who is now 78 and no longer actively investigating, believes Hartmann is dead. He would be 117 years old if alive today. Even if he survived into the 1990s or 2000s, he's gone now. What matters isn't whether he died free or whether he faced justice. What matters is documenting the truth of what happened so we understand how thoroughly the system failed. The failure was systematic. The death certificate wasn't scrutinized because tens of thousands of death certificates were being processed in 1945 and 1946, and chaplain signatures were considered reliable. The Red Cross travel documents weren't verified because the ICRC was issuing thousands of documents to displaced persons and relied on witness statements that could easily be fabricated. The Paraguayan immigration records didn't flag Carl Stein because he arrived with legal documents and no criminal record. The CIA intelligence from 1952 wasn't investigated because it was fragmentary, uncertain, and low priority compared to Cold War espionage concerns. Each individual failure was understandable given the context. Collectively, they created a system in which a wanted war criminal could obtain legal identity documents, purchase property, operate a business, travel internationally, and live comfortably for at least 15 years while officially dead. Klaus Hartmann was not exceptional in his escape. He was typical of a cohort of mid-ranking Nazi officials who evaded justice through careful planning, exploitation of chaotic post-war conditions, and the simple fact that pursuing every potential case was administratively impossible. The major figures, the architects of genocide, the camp commandants, the senior SS leaders, received intense scrutiny. The logistics officers, the administrators, the bureaucrats who enabled the machinery of murder but didn't personally pull triggers or operate gas chambers often slipped through. History remembers the trials at Nuremberg. It forgets the thousands who were never tried, the files that were closed with notation marks about death certificates that were never verified, the intelligence reports with question marks in the margins that nobody followed up on. The evidence conclusively proves Klaus Hartmann faked his death, escaped to South America, and lived freely for at least 15 years. The evidence suggests he was never seriously pursued despite intelligence indicating his possible location. The evidence cannot prove what happened to him after 1964, whether he died or relocated again, whether he lived in comfort or fear, whether he ever expressed remorse or remained unrepentant until the end. What matters is documenting that he got away with it, that the system designed to pursue Nazi war criminals was porous enough to allow a man with mid-level connections and basic planning skills to simply walk away from his past, assume a new identity, and live unmolested while running a timber business in the jungle. The compound in the Paraguayan Chaco is a monument to that failure. Not a grand monument, just a deteriorating concrete foundation and collapsed wooden buildings and fruit trees growing wild in their original rows. Evidence that Klaus Hartmann was here, that he lived, that he prospered in his small way, that nobody stopped him.